chapter 16. If you want to follow along in your Bibles, the verses are printed in your bulletin. How many of you recognize the picture up here on the screen? You know who this guy's name is? The guy's name is Keith Richards. He's lead guitarist for an old rock group called Rolling Stones. Even if you don't recognize this picture, you have no idea who the Rolling Stones are, if you just see a picture up there of somebody that looks like they're so old they ought to be dead, you get the point. Those of us who know Keith Richards, though, are shocked that he's still alive, right? And so the meme here, the idea, that's right, it's 2019, I'm still alive, I'm still here. My good friend lives out west, his name's Kim Polanski, went to Bible college with him. He posted this on Facebook with this following comment. He said, "That's right, Keith, you're still here. And let me explain why." And he quotes 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 9. "Because God is not willing that anyone should perish, but wants everyone to come to repentance." You know why Keith Richards is still alive? So he has another chance to get right with God. You know why you're still alive? So you have another chance to reach somebody else who needs to be right with God. That's why we're still here. That's why I love this passage that we're going to be looking at today in Acts chapter 16, because it starts with people who are interested in God. And I don't have time to cover the whole passage, so I'm going to skip that because I'm just guessing it's a little bit easier to talk to people who are already interested in God. I want to go to the guy who's not even thinking about God, because we run into a lot of those kind of people, don't we? Let's jump right into the middle of the story. In the interest of time, I'll try to explain what's going on, but I just want us to see what the Bible points to. In fact, there are going to be three things. Just look for them as we go through these verses. Three things that are shocking that happen. And if you've read this story too many times, maybe they're not as shocking, but try to read it with new eyes. Look at this story and see some things that are like, wow, did I read that correctly? Did that really happen? Because I think God's trying to draw our attention to it, because these are the things that God uses to reach people who aren't even interested, and yet they need God. Jumping in the middle of the story, I want to start in verse 22. Here's what it says. "The crowd joined in the attack against Paul and Silas, and the magistrates ordered them to be stripped and beaten with rods." Again, without taking time to go into the background here, they're in trouble. What's new? God's people get in trouble all the time. I got to tell you this, so they're in trouble for doing something good. So don't be surprised when things like that happen to you. I hope it's not this bad. But they're stripped, they're beaten. Verse 23, "After they had been severely flogged, they were thrown into prison, and the jailer," this is the guy we're going to be focusing on, "the jailer was commanded to guard them carefully." Please take note of that. He's supposed to guard them. So what does he do? Verse 24, "When he received these orders, he put them in the inner cell, fastened their feet in the stocks." This is where the English translation does us a disfavor, because it sounds like he's given an order, watch these guys carefully, and that's what he's doing. That's not what the original language communicates. Here's what the original language communicates. He's given an order, watch these guys. So he takes them and he tortures them. Now, where in the world do I get that? Because the word used here, that's translated stocks, you and I usually think of, the Western days, the Western Front, in the United States of America. Somebody got in trouble and they put their head in their hands, kind of in this yoke wooden thing. That's not what we're talking about here. This was a contraption designed to bring pain. Yes, it would lock your feet and your hands, sometimes your head, but usually they'd start by taking your legs and stretching them as far as they can possibly go before they locked it down. They would contort your body, and then they would lock it into place. In other words, he's given this order, watch these guys, and it's kind of like, ha, 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 a wicked laugh. I'm gonna make them wish they'd never lived. One of those kind of things. It's important to know what kind of guy we're dealing with here. Verse 25, about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them. I guess so. Okay, to me, this is my number one. You don't expect people who are being tortured to be singing praises to God. They're singing instead of sorrow. That's the first thing I'd bring to your attention as we go through this. "Suddenly there was a violent earthquake," verse 26, "and the foundations of the prison were shaken. At once all the prison doors flew open and everyone's chains came loose." Okay, I'm going to put a number 2 here. You know why? Because I don't know if you've been in an earthquake before. I've been in earthquakes. Things fall off the cabinets, and I wouldn't be surprised if a door, was ajar or something like that. But somebody with handcuffs on, and all of a sudden the handcuffs come loose. Earthquakes, you expect destruction. You don't expect deliverance. If I'm keeping score here, there are two shocking things that have happened so far. Number one, we've got singing instead of sorrow. Number two, we've got deliverance instead of destruction. An earthquake, you expect the roof to fall in on you. You don't expect all the doors open and all the chains come off. Yet that's what happens. Verse 27, the jailer woke up. When he saw the prison doors open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself. The reason for this is in that day, if you lost your prisoners, it was your life for theirs. So he knew that his life was going to be taken. He just decided, I'm going to do it myself instead of letting somebody else kill me. So he drew his sword, was about to kill himself because he thought the prisoners had escaped. But Paul shouted, "Don't harm yourself. We are all here." This is shocking thing number 3. Most prisoners, I mean, think with me for just a minute. All the prison doors open, all the chains fall off, and the prisoners stay. This is why I wanted you to know what happened a little bit earlier, because they knew at this time. They left, who got in trouble? They knew it was the jailer. That jerk. That guy who was supposed to guard us, instead he tortured us. You know what? That's on him. That would be a typical attitude too, that I wouldn't be surprised to find, right? So here's why I'm going to say it. 3 shocking things so far. First of all, we've got singing instead of sorrow. We've got deliverance instead of destruction. And we've got remaining instead of running. When you expect people to leave, they stayed. For what kind of reasons? The jailer probably couldn't figure out at all. I imagine this jailer is shocked. It says, verse 29, the jailer called for lights and rushed in and fell trembling. His life's in their hands. He fell trembling before Paul and Silas. He then brought them out and asked, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" This is where I really regret not having more time with you, because if I could, there's several clues in this passage. If I could just show them to you, I just want to challenge you to do a little bit of background work here, because in Philippi, everything we can tell, every detail points to the fact this guy probably had no idea about God at all. This is as pagan as it gets. And yet this guy, who probably had no background, wasn't even thinking about it, wasn't even interested. And the reason I'm saying this is I'm betting you work with somebody like that. You know somebody who doesn't know much about God, and they don't care to know about God. And yet this guy is asking, what? "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" Wow, wouldn't it be great to be able to get people in that kind of situation? That's what we're going to focus on, but I want to read a couple more verses to finish the story. He says, they replied, "Believe in the Lord Jesus and you will be saved, you and your household." Everybody in your household who's old enough to believe, right? Then they spoke the word of the Lord to him. Why would they do that? Because you got to believe. So they're explaining it to him. They spoke the word of the Lord to him and all the others in his household. At that hour of the night, the jailer took them and washed their wounds, and immediately he and all his household were baptized. What do you have here? I think it's a mistake, and I think it often gets misrepresented when people say that the jailer and his family believed and became Christians, and then to show that they became Christians, they got baptized. Or to say that they believed and later on they got baptized. That is not what this passage is talking about. You know what it's saying here? It's saying they believed. How do we know they believed? Because they were baptized. Now, how do I know that? Flip over to Colossians if you have your Bibles. If not, we're going to have the verse up here on the screen. In Colossians, the 2nd chapter, it makes this statement in verse 12. Having been buried with him in baptism, we're talking about our baptism again. It says, in this baptism, in which you were also raised with him through what? Your faith in the working of God. Is baptism a work? Yes, it's God's work. It's your faith. Listen, I don't want to make this too simple, but I really want you to remember this. If I were turning to somebody and they were having a hard time getting out of a chair, and I put my hand out like this, and I said, "I can help you out of the chair. Trust me." How would I know you trust me? Would you say, well, they trusted Mark and they put their hand in Mark's hand? Or would you say they trusted Mark by putting their hand in? Do you understand this? Our baptism is an expression of our faith. I don't know if you've heard this guy named Bob Russell. I talk about him from time to time. Really admire this guy because he preached at what was the largest Christian church. In fact, I think it still is the largest Christian church in the United States of America. And for years he was preaching there, so no doubt they had a lot of baptisms. They had a lot of baptisms. While he was preaching there, they probably still do, right? That's important to know because we're talking about thousands and thousands of people coming to these services that they have there. It was the end of a Sunday. And for a preacher, it takes a lot out of you to preach several times, right? Well, he preached several times, including preaching at night, had several baptisms, meetings in the afternoon. It was a long day, started before the sun came up. Here he is, end of the day, at the very last service, 5 people come forward to be baptized. Not an unusual thing. This is Bob done this before, right? So at the end of a very long day, 5 people come forward to be baptized. The 5th guy, the last guy. So are you getting this picture? You know, it's like 16-hour day, tired, everything else. But, you know, what an exciting note to end on. 5 more people being baptized in Christ. Well, unfortunately, the 5th guy, the last guy for him to baptize at the end of a very long day, also happened to be the biggest person for him to baptize. And it's not so much big, it's tall. I'm telling you, big people are buoyant. That's not a problem. It's tall people that sometimes give you a challenge if you don't remember to take a big step. I'm just saying this because the next time you baptize somebody, take a big step. Make sure, well, long day, 5th person, last person to be baptized. And Bob, you know, even the greatest pitchers throw one off now and then, right? Well, Bob, 5th guy, last guy, long day to be baptized, kind of lost his grip on the way down. Right? We're in a baptismal, right? He loses his grip. And the bad part, Bob's telling this story, you know, later on. This all happened in just a matter of a second or two, right? Loses his grip on the way down. Well, the problem is this big guy realizes that Bob loses his grip, right? And just instinct-wise, right, kind of takes over. When somebody's lowering you in water and they drop you, you know, instinct-wise, you don't just drop, right? It's the spare my life thing, right? And so can you picture this all taking place in a baptistry at the end of a very formal service? These people are being baptized. Bob loses his grip. The tall guy halfway down realizes that Bob loses his grip and starts doing this number, right? And so it gets really interesting if you're at church then. So this guy's starting to do this number on the way down. And Bob, to me, this is the best part. Bob, split second, you know, if he would have had more time to think about this, he probably would have helped the guy up and redone. But no, halfway down, Bob's thinking, this guy needs to go under. You know, if he does too much of this, he's not going under. So Bob does the lunge on top of the, I'll get him to go under. You know, again, all split second. You know, if you had time to push pause, you probably would have done it different. But he didn't, and so he lunges on top of this guy, and people described it as the wrestling match baptism. You know, people in the front row said they got wet. So it's one of those kind of things. Okay. Next morning, they have staff meeting, and this is a size church, probably a couple hundred people on staff at this time. At their staff meeting every week, they give something called the Oops Award. The Oops Award. And the Oops Award goes to whoever made the biggest mistake the previous day at Sunday services, right? You know, somebody forgot to make an announcement, or, you know, somebody sang off key or whatever. And Bob comes in, and they start off the staff meeting. He says, okay, guys, we don't need to vote today. Just give me the trophy. I know. I'm the one. And all the staff members and a couple of people voiced, they said, oh, no, you don't get off that easy. And so all the staff are seated. Can you picture this? And at the appropriate time, they open the doors, and everybody turned their attention. One of the associate ministers has on a baptismal robe with a big life preserver around his neck, right? And he marches to the front with the Oops Award, and he awards it to Bob, and they all have a good laugh. And Bob thinks it's all over until the meeting's over. When he goes to use the bathroom, he opens up the bathroom door. Somebody had taken a little G.I. Joe and stuck him in the toilet, I get tickled hearing other churches making the kind of mistakes that I make. You know, I get that, but there's a reason why I'm telling you this story. Why in the world, in a split second, you know, before you really have a chance to think through, why in the world, in a split second, would Bob lunge on top of this guy to make sure he got him under? Because I think it's instinct for a man who studied his Bible so much, because he realizes this is an important thing. Listen, just one more. We say this passage so often, so I'm trusting that maybe you know it, and if not, I hope you hear it a bunch when you come here. Here it is. It's Matthew chapter 28. verses 18 through the very end of that chapter. It's the end of the Gospel of Matthew. And Jesus has completed his earthly ministry, and he gives marching orders. A lot of people refer to it as the Great Commission, right? Remember how Jesus says this? He starts in verse 18. He says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given unto me. He's saying, listen, I am the expert on life. I am the expert on the next life. I've got this all figured out. You've got questions. I've got answers. That's in essence what Jesus is saying. So here he says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been granted unto me. Therefore, go into all nations and make disciples. How do you do that? Baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And teach them to obey everything I have commanded you. You know why I'm emphasizing that connector there? Because baptism is not put on the side of obeying everything God commanded. Did you catch that? Baptism's on this side. You know why? Because it's our faith and the grace of God that saves us, and that's where baptism is, on this side. Once you become a Christian, then you obey. It's not you become a Christian and then the first thing you do is get baptized and obey everything else God says. That's not the way Jesus said it. You're baptized into relationship with Christ because that's where God works on your life. We trust him to do that, and from that day forward, everything he says we put into practice. Okay, that was my introduction. Because that's where the jailer is. That's where that's why we celebrate baptisms. That's why we applaud. That's why right? And that's where the jailer was. My question for us this morning, and I am going to make the rest of this really brief though, how do we get people there? Especially people like a jailer who wasn't even looking. I think there's 3 lessons in this passage. Acts chapter 16. The history book of the New Testament, book of Acts, is telling us a story where another family comes to faith. Another family is baptized into Christ. I just want us to review in our mind the verses that we have already read and ask ourselves the question, how did they get there? How did this guy, who from everything we can tell, knew nothing about God and wasn't interested in even finding out anything about God, how did he get to the point where he said, what must I do to be saved? Well, Luke, or God through Luke, focuses on 3 major things in this story that just jump right off the page at you. There's singing instead of sorrow. There's deliverance instead of destruction. There's remaining instead of running. Can you go through these 3 lessons with me? What does it mean to sing in the midst of sorrow instead of being overcome with sorrow? It means to live like a Christian in the midst of your sorrow. Listen, we bleed like everybody else bleeds. Our bones break just as easily as anybody else's bones break. Our hearts break, and we mourn and we grieve, just like any other person. But we as God's people have a perspective. We as God's people see something that enable us to handle the very same hardships that other people go through that crush them. But they give us reason to sing. Oh, how can I, in just a matter of a few minutes, I mean, we spend so much time talking about this. Let me just go back to one illustration. I don't know how many of you like to play cards or board games or things like that, but if you do, and if you play those kind of games very often, you've probably run into that person. That person who forgets it's just a game. You know what I mean? In Monopoly, yeah. I mean, they're just all about, getting all your money, and they don't just drive you out of the game. I mean, they rub it in. You know what I'm talking about. That person who gets so caught up in the game. If you're somebody like me, you're very tempted before the end of the game to reach across the table and grab the person by the shoulders and just start shaking them violently and saying something like, "It's just a game!" Right? Because you're going to ruin some relationships that go beyond this game when this game's over. In other words, there's life after the game. I know it might seem trite, but to me it's a very powerful metaphor of life. Christians understand that from eternity's perspective, I love this saying, Christians understand from eternity's perspective, the worst possible suffering in this life is like one terrible night at a bad hotel. Oh, I know that seems like, wow, Mark, how can you say that given the Holocaust, given so many things that have happened? Here's how I can say that. 100,000 years from now, people who died in prison camps are going to look back on their life that they lived here, and they're going to look at it as one terrible night in a bad hotel. But you and I, as followers of Christ, see that now. And we know who's in control. So we can sing in the midst of sorrows. Do you get it? The reason that's so important is the world needs to see us singing. There's deliverance instead of destruction. Deliverance instead of destruction. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, yeah, how in the world? When's the last time an earthquake knocked the chains off of me? You know, when's the last time an earthquake came and all my bills were paid? You know, when's the last time something like that happened? Listen, maybe it's because I'm just guessing, but maybe it's because we're too narrow at the way we look at this. There's a story that comes to mind. In fact, there are several stories that come to mind. I'm just going to go with one of my favorite ones. It's one of those Tony Campolo stories. I don't know if you know about that guy or not. So many interesting things that have happened to this guy. He was a preacher at one time anyway, and he was asked to preach at a little country church. He went to preach at this country church, and it was way far away. You know, he drove there, and it was quite a long drive. When he got there, never been to this church before, small community and everything. He's sitting, I guess he's sitting somewhere towards the front of the auditorium waiting because they're going to call him up on stage and he's going to speak to them. He's going to deliver the message that evening or that day. And while he's waiting, somebody in the small church, somebody's called on to have a prayer. And so usually, you know, you try to, when you're somebody else is praying, you're trying to follow along with the prayer. So he's paying attention. This guy's praying. And this guy who's praying starts to pray about a friend. He's praying about a friend of his. And when he tells this story, he gives the name. I don't remember the name. So I'm going to call the guy Charles Schultz. I just want to call him Charles Schultz, okay? This is not his name, but that's what I'm going to call him, okay? So back to the story. This guy, in his prayer, he's praying about his friend Charles Schultz, which is not really his real name. But anyway, he's praying about Charles Schultz, and here's what he does in his prayer. He says, God, I want to bring Charles Schultz before your throne. You know, the guy who lives half mile south of town on the other side of the railroad tracks. You turn right by the 7-Eleven. You go down 3 houses, the blue house on the left-hand side. That guy, that's the guy I'm talking about. And Tony's thinking to himself, God doesn't need directions to this guy's house. You know, you're wasting all of our time by doing. Well, the thing that really got to him, you know, he's praying about Charles and about the fact that he's thinking about leaving his family. He's given up working on his marriage, and they've got little kids that depend on him. But he's contemplating just throwing it all away and leaving town. God, keep him here. You know, the guy who lives half mile south of town, the other side of railroad tracks, turn right by the 7-Eleven, third house on the left, you know, blue house and stuff. He gives directions more than once. And Tony's thinking, this is one of the strangest prayers I've ever heard, right? After the message is over and everything's done, he's still thinking about that prayer. On the way home, Tony's the kind of guy who picks up hitchhikers. There's a guy thumbing a ride out of town, so he picks him up because it's a long drive. He wants somebody to, you know, pass the time, right? He picks this guy up and says, where are you headed? You know, the guy says, I don't know, just out of town. I got to get out of this town. And it's a little bit more small talk. By the way, what's your name? He says, my name's Charles Schultz. Tony turns his car around, does a U-turn, drives right back into town, goes south of town about a mile over on the other side of the railroad tracks, turns right at the 7-Eleven, goes to the third house on the left, the blue house, pulls up in the driveway, turns to the guy, puts a finger in his face and says, you need to stay and reconcile with your wife and kids. To say this guy was shocked is an understatement. How did this guy know? Listen, the reason I say this is maybe more of an extreme example. Listen. I've been in discipleship groups with more than half the people in this room. And through the years, I have heard you tell stories about prayers that have been answered. Prayers that have been answered and God working in your life. Things that have just happened. You didn't know how you're going to pay the bills. You didn't know how you're going to face the hardship. They didn't go away. The bills sometimes were took a whole lot longer. But on the other side, you made it to the other side. You know what? The world needs to hear those stories about how God has answered your prayer and the things he's done in your life. They need to see singing instead of sorrow. They need to see the deliverance instead of the destruction. We're beaten down, but we are not destroyed. And they need to see us remain instead of run. When everybody else would say, that's on you, Christians say, I forgive you. You know, the same Sermon on the Mount, In fact, the same chapter, Matthew chapter 5, where Jesus said, by this, all men will know you're my disciples, right? The way you live, he also says, turn the other cheek. The guy's name's Ben Sass. Ben's a senator in Nebraska. He's written a book recently, powerful book. Title of the book's Them, T-H-E-M, simple title. In this book, he tells a personal experience. His wife, at a very young age, their kids were quite little at the time. She had a terrible medical event that took place in her life. In fact, they rushed her to the hospital. She spent several days in the hospital. At first, the way I understand it, they weren't even sure that they could save her. They didn't know how they're going to deal with this. It was a scary thing. The kids were little. His wife, young wife, she's supposed to be in good health. All these things taking place. He's got all these stresses from his job and everything else, making sure the kids are taken care of. He has spent several days in the hospital at this point, and he decides instead of eating another meal down at the cafeteria, he's going to go out and get a little fresh air, go across the street. There's a TGI Fridays, a restaurant. He's going to order something there and, try to clear his mind a little bit. So he leaves the hospital. Background here, though, his wife and all this other stuff, stressing him out. Leaves the hospital, get a little fresh air, goes over to TGI Fridays. When you come in, you don't just sit down. You tell the hostess person there, I'm by myself, get a seat over here or whatever. But the hostess person said, well, wait just a minute. There's several places to sit. Other people come in and stuff. And Ben is kind of lost in his own thought, as you can well imagine. So many things going on. And then he notices that several other people have been seated and he's still standing there. So he comes up to the hostess and manager's close by. He says, hey, what's going on? Like, am I nobody? Why are you seating all these? I'm by myself. There's several seats up there by the bar. There's several places I could sit. And he said it became obvious pretty quickly that the hostess, maybe it's because he's lost in thought over here, had forgotten about him. Right? It didn't do it on purpose. But Ben said, to my shame, I blew up. I griped at the manager, this whole thing, how dare you, do stuff like this? You treat all your customers, one of those things. Kind of blew up. He said it wasn't very many minutes later that he realized, I got to apologize to everybody. He says, you know why I did that? I did not do that because I was upset at that hostess. I unloaded on her because there was a whole bunch of things out of control that I couldn't do anything about, that I was frustrated about. But here was a situation right in front of me I could do something about, and boom, she got it. You understand what happened there? I so appreciate him telling that story because here's the point he makes. He's a senator in Nebraska. He's been involved in politics his whole life, and he says, he convinced me that we are more polarized as a people today than we have ever been since the Civil War. People don't just have their political views on one side or another. They hate the guts of anybody who has a different view. I'm telling you what, there is such animosity and hatred, and I think he accurately puts his finger on it. It's not that people have different views. Oh, I know sometimes we really disagree with those different views, but there's something else going on. You know what it is? We live in a secular culture that has taken God out of the picture, and there's a hole in people's hearts. Yeah, they're mad about stuff. You know why? It's not so much the stuff. And don't argue with me after. Well, you can argue with me after church if you want to. I know some of those things are important. I'm just telling you, it's blown out of proportion because there's something deeper. People need God and they don't even know it. That's why this world, these people that you and I live with, need to see us singing in the sorrows, delivered instead of destroyed, remaining instead of running out on them. So those very people will say, what must I do to have a life like that? That's what they're going to say when they see you, right?